Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to the witnesses for being here. I want to, I keep hearing about the Green New Deal. It's a straw man. Fewer than half the Democrats have sponsored it. It's already been killed in the Senate. So I don't think we should spend a lot of time talking about it. I mean, there are component parts of it that have to deal with climate that I certainly think would be worth talking about, but it's become just this straw man, and it seems to end the discussion and not lead to much nuance. With respect to nuance, I get the sense that that there's kind of a consensus that it might be appropriate to debt finance the kinds of things that would generate a return. So that might be infrastructure, training, investment, education for people who could add to their earning potential, basic research. Of course, we did not develop GPS through the government. We did not develop the internet, but we led the research that allowed the private sector to invest in those things. And I think it certainly was good for the country and good for the United States to be the locus of that, I think, as well, as I think your other statement implied. But I do want to talk a little bit about bad debt, and I suspect that bad debt, and maybe Mr. Bernstein, you could answer this, might be financing or borrowing money to pay your ongoing expenses, whether it's particularly the ones that are non-cyclical. So if you think about the social benefit programs, I mean, is this something that we should be concerned about? Is it appropriate? Is that what you mean by bad debt?
You know, it isn't. And
what is an example of bad debt then?
Well, I think that, so I keep raising the tax cuts from my perspective. We don't have to rehearse that. There's another one, though, that I haven't had a chance to talk about, and it gets to something you were just raising, which is, you know, the fact that other countries insure their full populations for about 10 or 12% of their GDP, and we do so for 18% of our GDP. So call that 6 to 8% of GDP that is, you know, basically waste in the delivery system of the way we provide healthcare. So I think we could slow the cost of healthcare growth. Getting back to your first question, though, I'd want to do so in a way that protects vulnerable people.
Okay, so would you think it's appropriate for us to debt finance the cost of healthcare?
Oh, well, we very much do so, of course, and yeah, I mean, I think these are I mean, whether it's healthcare or retirement security through Social Security, I mean, these are clearly essential public goods,
right,
and we're not raising enough revenue to pay for them. So yeah, I consider that to be reasonable debt in this climate.
Oh, okay. I haven't found an answer yet, I don't think, but I'll ask Mr. Taylor. You advocate for the 2017 tax cut. Should we be cutting taxes more?
I think we should be looking for tax reform that promotes more economic growth.
So
it also deals with other problems, but I think it's still an important issue for the United States.
The knock on that bill was that, not that it didn't help some people, but that it helped a lot of people who didn't need help. And that if you give money back to people who already have swollen bank accounts and have a lot of savings, it's not going to generate the kind of economic activity. And in fact, all the economists surveyed by the University of Chicago, I think 38 of them, agreed that it wouldn't pay for itself. And I think even Mr. McConnell admitted we had to generate 4% growth in the economy to pay for those tax cuts. So my question, I guess, is rhetorical, is where does this end? And if our revenues are at a low point compared to GDP, isn't it really time to think about how to get more revenue in? And maybe should wealthy people pay more, the ones who have plenty of earnings to part with?
I think it's time to, if there's
maybe more directly, what would you do for American tax policy? What would be your next step to make sure we
consider more ways to reform? There was very little done on the personal side. There could be done more on that. The tax cuts are not permanent anyway. They're going to disappear. They, again, based on the basic economic theory, you want to have more encouragement of investment, because that's where more productivity comes from.
Right.
More productivity leads to higher wages and higher incomes. It's just sort of the most basic thing in economics. You don't want to discourage businesses from investing. We want to encourage them, because that will make their workers more productive in the system, as it has for many, many years.
If you acknowledge we should tax people at some level, how would I, as a policymaker, determine what that level should be?
I think the first thing is, what do you want your spending level to be? And there's not a discussion about that. and then you have a way to finance that. I think there's reasons that sometimes you
Assume I,
have
assume I wanted my spending level to be what it is today, which is $1 trillion more than we're taking in. What would I do to raise
I
that
think
money?
the projections of spending are that it's going, 28% of GDP, it's the projections.
Well,
So that's not going to work. So
assume
you
it's,
have to do.
assume
you
it's
have to-
20%, and right now I'm taking in 16%. What should I do to tax policy to raise that money?
I think the tax cut that's in place will raise more. This notion that it's not paying for itself is not really true if you look over the long term. It's true over maybe a couple years or 3 years, but it's not true over the longer term. Growth increases. You don't have to be,
I'm out of time, but maybe I'd ask you in writing, like if I say 20% is a historical level at which we spend, invest, and we're taxing at
I think the
16%.
Budget Committee, the Congress has to decide what's the right level.
Well, I'm not a professor at Stanford. That's why I asked you a question about how I would answer that question. I mean, we're all of people of good faith who want to figure out what the right answer is. But, you know, I never hear from people, you know, what the appropriate way to set that number is. And it strikes me that some people are being undertaxed, and they're not the people who are paying payroll taxes. So I guess we'll have a continued discussion later, but I would really like to know the answer to that question.
Can I submit a memo on that to you?
Absolutely, you may. Gentleman's time has expired. I now recognize the gentleman from Texas.